Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Check it out at carsandbids.com. This is a 1998 Mercedes-Benz A140. And in fact, it's my 1998 Mercedes-Benz A140. I have always wanted an original Mercedes A-Class. These were never sold here in North America, so I imported one. And I suspect I have the only original A-Class here in the United States. Today, I'm going to show you around my latest ridiculous automotive purchase. All right, time for the quirks and features of my Mercedes A-Class. So I'm going to start with a general overview of the original A-Class, then I'll get into all of its many quirks and features. Then I'll give you an explanation of why I bought this thing, which you're probably curious about, and then I'll drive it and give it a DougScore. So let's start with that general overview. The original Mercedes A-Class debuted in the summer of 1997, and it was tremendously controversial at the time. It's a small Mercedes-Benz front-wheel drive compact car, and at the time, Mercedes just didn't do that. People thought it was crazy for Mercedes-Benz to enter the compact car segment, luxury, high-end, upscale Mercedes-Benz lowering themselves to a compact car. Now, when the original A-Class first came out in August of '97, there were two versions you could choose from, both powered by gasoline four-cylinder engines. There was the A140 with a 1.4-liter four-cylinder that made about 80 horsepower, or you could step up to the mighty A160 with a 1.6-liter variation of the same engine, and that made about 100 horsepower. Now, my A-Class is the base model A140, the workhorse of the lineup, the entry-level everyman version with merely 80 horsepower. Now, throughout the production run of the original A-Class, of course, more engines were offered, gasoline, diesel, various different versions, but these were the debut powertrains in '97. Now, the interesting thing about these engines, aside from how pathetically low on power they were, is how they were fitted into the engine bay. You can see it's kind of slanted. That obviously was intentional. The engine was mounted at a 60-degree angle inside the engine bay. It was called the sandwich engine design. They did this for safety. The thinking was the car gets hit in the front. It has a small, short front end since it's a small, short car, and that could be risky to occupants, but the engine slanted this way would push down underneath the passenger compartment and not intrude or potentially hurt anybody, and so that's why they mounted it like this. Very interesting and quirky, like a lot of the rest of this car. And that included the design, which was also quite controversial. The original A-Class was designed by Steve Mattin, Mercedes' chief designer at the time, who also designed the SLR. That's right, I've got a manual transmission Mercedes designed by the same guy who did the SLR. Feeling pretty good about myself, or I would be if it wasn't a first-generation A-Class. But anyway, the design was controversial. The styling, which I'll get to in a second, but also the proportions, which came to be a problem for this car very quickly in its life. So here's the deal. When I say this is a compact car, I mean really compact. This is only 142 inches long, which makes it 8 inches shorter in length than a Mini Cooper two-door. But the original A-Class is 7 inches taller in height than a Mini Cooper two-door. So short in length, but tall in height sounds like a dangerous combination, and it was. There is a Swedish car review magazine that performs something called the moose test, or the elk test, where they swerve at high speeds as if they were avoiding a moose or an elk, and the A-Class rolled over during the test. As controversial as it was for Mercedes-Benz to enter the compact compact car segment, creating an unsafe rollover-prone car jacked up the controversy way further. Mercedes-Benz initially kind of laughed it off, said it wasn't a real-world situation, but criticism was relentless, and quickly they recalled every A-Class made and added stability control, and then added stability control standard to all A-Classes made after that. Now, despite the fact that the proportions led to some questionably safe driving characteristics, I personally always loved the way these looked. The tall hatchback thing always appealed to me, and I think they executed it in a very interesting way. One example, these weird triangle windows in back. Instead of just a normal, boring hatchback rear window, the side windows come up to a point, and the rear window wraps around to a point below that, so it looks like there's two triangles on the side, which is kind of cool. I also always loved the long, flat, sloping front, which was somewhat common on small hatchbacks and vans in Europe, but rarely seen on any designs in North America. Overall, this design language, like most things about this car, was the subject of controversy, but I've always thought it was pretty cool and definitely distinctive. But anyway, next we move inside to the many interesting quirks and features of this car in here, starting with the key, which you can see the slot to stick it on your key ring is just the A-Class. It's a side profile of the car, and the slot is the side windows, and that is such a cool little quirky Easter egg that proved this car was more fun than other Mercedes-Benz models. And that's further proven when you get inside and you see the patterned cloth upholstery. Yes, that's right. This ridiculous patterned cloth, very 90s. And again, it was Mercedes-Benz trying to appeal to the kind of younger, hipper people who bought compact cars, telling them, hey, even stodgy rich people's Mercedes-Benz can be cool and fun like you. Mercedes did a similar thing with the climate controls, which you see the buttons are arranged in this wavy line in the center control stack. Instead of just normal, boring horizontal buttons, you got a wavy line. It was how Germans communicated that they could have fun too. Instead of straight, a little curve. It is worth pointing out, though, that on this wavy line, the button on the left for recirculating air does have a silhouette of the A-Class, which adds a cool little personalized quirk. But the rest of this interior is very unusual because it's a mix of high-end Mercedes-Benz parts and crappy compact car trash stuff mixed in a very unusual way. For instance, the turn signal stalk. This is the same one they used in all the other Mercedes-Benz models. It feels weighty and serious, and they had it in the S-Class. The gauge cluster, same deal, surprisingly upscale. It looks like a high-end Mercedes model gauge cluster, and the middle of the needles is clear to let you see through the needles and see your odometer and other displays in the gauge cluster. That was a high-end touch for a car like this. You even had this little button next to the gauge cluster that let you switch between the outside temperature and the current time. You couldn't see both, so it wasn't that luxurious, but the fact that you had that optionality is nicer than you'd expect from a lot of cheap, crappy compact cars in the 90s. Some other upscale touches in here. The light switch is the same one they used in all the other Mercedes-Benz models from this era, so it feels nice and high quality, like it doesn't really have any right to be in a car like this. You also had power locks in this car. You press one of the locks, the rest of them all lock automatically, which was a high-end feature. And in that area, you can also see side airbags, which was a nice safety feature. Side airbags in a compact car in the 90s, that sandwich engine design that would keep you safe in a frontal crash. If only this car didn't roll over at the flick of a wrist, it would have been really safe. Anyway, other nice features in here, you got power mirrors. Interestingly, the control is placed in the center stack here, so the passenger also has access to power mirrors, which makes no sense, but that's where it is, and it operates pretty normally. Now, next to that power mirror control, you can see the fated ASR button, which of course was the stability control that Mercedes-Benz had to add to these after pressure from that rollover moose test situation. situation. So some high-end stuff in this car, but then there's the cheap stuff. Also in this center stack, you can see a lot of blank buttons. This is not a very top-end version of this car, and it had some cheap stuff. Speaking of blank buttons, there are two power window switches in the center, which is very nice. Power windows in a car like this, but there's only two, and that's because the rear windows are crank-controlled manual windows. Mercedes-Benz gave you power front windows, but they cheaped out on power rear windows, and rear passengers had to manually roll down the windows themselves. Now, another cheapo item in this interior is the steering wheel, which you can see is vinyl. Cheapo, commercial bus-grade vinyl. No leather, no stitching, just vinyl with no steering wheel controls either, although you see the blank area in the center where they would be on a nicer car, but not this one. And another cheap control, how about this lever to adjust the seat position and move it back or forwards? This plastic lever with little dots on it, I guess so you knew when you were pulling. But it's not even metal. They couldn't even give you that like so many other cars do. They stayed plastic to make it cheap. Another interesting item in the original A-Class interior is the dashboard, which you can see is kind of wavy itself, like the climate controls. The strange part is it has no relation to the door panel. It ends, the door panel starts, they have different materials, they do not go together in any cohesive design. It's like they were created completely separately by two teams who weren't talking to each other at all. This is very unusual. Also a little strange, this switch at the end of the dashboard to open or close the climate vent. You have that on driver's side and on passenger side. A little bit of an odd way to do it. And speaking of climate controls in this car, this particular A140 has air conditioning, which was a huge deal because virtually none of these did. Back in Germany in the 90s, air conditioning was a big luxury, and frankly, it was mostly cold. You didn't need to spend the money to get that luxury feature, and so most people didn't in their A-Class, but the person who bought this new did, which of course I am very thankful for now. And next we move on to the back seat of the original A-Class, which is two things: small and basic. Small, well, this car is 8 inches shorter than a 2-door Mini Cooper, and yet it has 4 doors. So you couldn't have expected the back seat to be big, and indeed it isn't. The fact that you have a back seat with doors at all is something you should be happy about for a car like this, and indeed you do, and that's about all you can say for the back seat. Aside from that, there's nothing back here. You don't have climate vents, of course. You don't even have storage pockets behind the front seats. That would be a luxury not available on the A-Class. You have cup holders, but they're shared with the front seats. 2 cup holders for 5 seats, front and rear. You'll have to fight over them. One benefit, you do have the same patterned cloth upholstery that you did up front. This fun 90s quirky design. Again, Mercedes-Benz trying to remind you that it's funky and cool. They gave you the patterned cloth, but they couldn't give you rear power windows. That was too much for the A-Class. Frankly, considering how cheap and basic it is back here, the coolest thing you had in the back seat was this view out the bizarre triangle rear window. It's very strange when you look over your shoulder and see that triangle and then the one below it. Very different from any other rear 3/4 view out of any other hatchback. A nice little touch of the strange design of this car. And finally, we move on to the cargo area in the original A-Class. To get back here, you push on the exterior keyhole. It pops open the tailgate, you lift and discover a shockingly large cargo area. Not huge by any means, but again, this car is 8 inches shorter than a 2-door Mini Cooper, and it has 4 doors and still manages to have enough room for a cargo area this size. Not a huge one, but a practical one. Excellent and impressive packaging in this car, the original A-Class. So, last thing I want to talk about before I explain why I bought this vehicle is how it performed on the market. Normally, I like quirky, weird cars that were complete failures, like the Nissan Murano Cross Cabriolet, but this wasn't. Despite all the controversy around Mercedes-Benz making a compact car and lowering themselves down to that level, Mercedes sold over 1 million first-generation A-classes during its 7-year production run. It was a popular vehicle, although not a financially successful one. Going into this segment, creating a front-wheel drive small car for the first time cost Mercedes-Benz so much money that they reportedly lost around $1,500 on every single A-Class sold. It was a tremendously expensive, lost money, waste of financial resources project, although, as we know in hindsight, it was the beginning of a successful segment. Mercedes still sells an A-Class and 2 other small cars, the B-Class and the CLA. Audi makes a compact car, the A1 and the A3, and they had the A2 for a while, and BMW has had the 1 Series and the 2 Series. Small cars weren't something these luxury brands did until Mercedes blazed the trail with the A-Class. Unless, of course, the trail had a moose on it, in which case the A-Class would roll over. So that's a tour of the quirks and features, and now you're probably wondering why. I have a Carrera GT and a Ford GT. Why did I go and buy a cheap, crappy, front-wheel drive, 80 horsepower European small hatchback? And it's a reasonable question, so here's the answer. I just bought the Carrera GT, a very serious, exotic performance car, and I'm considering the purchase of another very serious, exotic performance car, which you'll find out about soon, or maybe not. I don't know. I haven't bought it yet. But the point is, 2 serious, exotic performance cars in a row, and that's just not me. I'm a weird car guy. I like the weird, the oddball, the quirky, the strange, and I wanted to go back to my roots and get something that felt more Doug. I like the Carrera GT, of course, but it's so serious, so real. I wanted something that was not that expensive and just plain fun and bizarre. And that is an A-Class in the United States. Now, to be clear, I didn't set out looking for an A-Class. Initially, I wanted an Audi A2, which was Audi's original tiny, tall hatchback that I've always liked even more, but they're not old enough yet. In order for a car to be easily imported to the States, it has to be 25 years old, and the A2 isn't there. So then I set my sights on the original Fiat Multipla, which is even stranger than the A2 or the A-Class, but that also wasn't quite old enough. It came out in November of '98, so 25 years old. You were looking for a November or December of '98 build to import it in '23. It was just too hard to find. So then I set my sights on the A-Class, which was more available since it came out before those cars in the summer of '97. There were going to be more options to choose from. So here is where I must give a huge thank you, massive gratitude to the people who helped me find this car. In the United States, Inbound Motorsports, located in New Jersey. It's run by my friend Rami, who is a fantastic guy, great car enthusiast, and reliable and honest, which are very important qualities. Also, thank you to Dutch Munich, located in Europe, who helped me source this car, find it in Europe, and make it nice, which is hard to do for an A-Class. I'm going to link both Inbound Motorsports and Dutch Munich in the description below to this auction, and if you want a car imported from Europe, they are the people to reach out to. But let's talk about how this happened. It's not easy to find an A-Class. Even though they made over 1 million of them, people didn't treat them well. They were little, compact, crappy cars. Nobody thought to preserve one. And so these guys went and looked at like 5 different A-Classes for me, and they all turned out to be crappy, rusty, or they had all sorts of problems, bad bodywork. I mean, they're cheap cars in Europe. They're just not nice. Nobody wants them. And then we found this one. This is a one-owner A140 that came from Germany, and it has around 60,000 miles on it. It's basically the nicest A-Class you could possibly find that's 25 years old to import. And it cost $2,200 to buy. That's the cost of the nicest A-Class in the world. In fact, it cost me a lot more to ship it to the port and then import it to the United States and then do various prep work to get it into this condition than it costs to buy, by far. Now, this is an A140, like I mentioned, and I would have liked the more powerful A160, but this car checked all of my boxes. Obviously, it's in nice shape, one owner, low miles, etc., but also has a manual transmission. These were made with automatics or automated manuals. That was sort of a weird in-between thing. I can't imagine that's reliable. I wanted a stick shift for reliability and driving enjoyment. It's also an unusual color. Mercedes made these in a lot of weird colors to try to appeal to that hip, younger audience. There were bright greens and yellows. We even looked at a pink one, and then we found this bright blue, which works just fine. It also had the patterned cloth upholstery, which I wanted. Felt very 90s Mercedes-Benz trying to be cool. And this car had air conditioning, which, like I mentioned before, is tremendously difficult to find. We didn't look at a single other A-Class that even had air conditioning, and I had written it off that I wasn't going to be able to get it until we found this one. So this is the perfect first generation A-Class, if such a thing could possibly exist. All right, driving my Mercedes-Benz A140. Now, Europeans watching this video are gonna laugh. They're gonna say, this Prince is so stupid. These aren't bad, boring cars. I get it. But they're cool to me. I mean, I always thought the design was neat, and you'd literally never see them here. In fact, I truly think I'm probably the only person who has one of these in the United States, mostly because in order to import one, you need to be both weird and rich. I got those bases covered. Like, it costs more to bring it here than to buy it, and so you're never gonna make any money importing it here. No one will ever do it, but I wanted it for myself, and so I'm the crazy person who's got enough money to bankroll this car. So the driving experience, that is the least interesting thing about this car by a pretty wide margin, as you probably already guessed. You know, I think the backstory behind it is interesting. Mercedes-Benz going into the compact car world. The Moose test thing that it flipped over is kind of a famous thing among, you know, Mercedes from this era, and a lot of enthusiasts know about that. The engine sandwich thing, a lot of people know that too. I think the design is quirky and interesting, but the driving experience, I mean, it just drives like a fairly dull little car with not that much horsepower. You want to think Honda Fit, you want to think, you know, similar vehicles like that, Chevy Sonic, cars like that. That's basically how it drives. It's not any more luxurious or, you know, nice or whatever because it's a Mercedes-Benz. It just drives like a fairly cheap, fairly standard little car. Now, this particular one, again, is in really nice shape. The suspension, like, I don't hear annoying noises. It doesn't make annoying sounds or bumps or rattle or whatever. And so I think this car does give me a pretty good concept of how it was, you know, back when it first came out. This car feels like it hasn't worn much since then. And the answer is normal, fine. You know, nothing crazy, nothing to write home about. It's a cool concept, it's a cool design, it's cool to have one in the United States where no one else does, but from a pure driving and ownership perspective, it's just a car. There's nothing particularly exciting about driving it. The manual transmission situation, the clutch is incredibly vague, and the gear selector is so vague and like butter, it's just laughable. There's no like notching it into gear and gearing down and throwing it around. It's just the softest shifting, like into tissues I've ever felt in my whole life. It is not intended to be like a fun performance car for throwing around the manual transmission. I drive a lot of manual cars where the gear selector situation is meant to be part of the fun. That is absolutely not the case in this car. It was like this in order to save gas and make it, you know, a reliable, economical car like so many European cars were at this time. So ultimately, the thing about this car is it's cool, it's weird, it's quirky, but driving it, sitting behind the wheel and actually using it, it's a car. It's a little, fairly dull, underpowered. I have to assume even by the standards of its day, it was pretty underpowered, especially in Europe. Only 80 horsepower for a city car back then. I mean, this was the base entry-level model, and power only increased from here. Like I said, the A160 had 100. By the end of it, there was also an A190 with 125 horsepower, so this was like the basest of base in terms of power. There were some diesel options that had less power but more torque. But I mean, this car just feels simple, basic. Again, it just drives like a car. It's just not don't go expecting like a high-end luxury car. That's not where the fun comes in of owning this car. The fun is the experience of having such kind of a weird, quirky, and interesting vehicle. And I'll report back on social media throughout my ownership, probably only a few months, honestly, about how people perceive it. I'm curious if people notice it or if it just kind of blends into the world. But we'll find out. And so that's the 1998 Mercedes-Benz A140. This is a fantastic piece of automotive engineering, unless you really think about it. No, I'm kidding. I am so thrilled to have this car. I'm happy to have it, and I'm happy to have something that isn't so serious. I'm a weird car guy at heart, and so I'm thrilled to be in another weird car after some serious ones. And now it's time to give my A140 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 44 out of 100, which places the A140 here against, well, I don't often review fairly basic 1990s economy cars, but it does okay against some sort of similar stuff, I guess. The A-Class is cool and quirky from an American perspective, and it's reasonably practical and shockingly affordable, but it's no fun to drive, not that it ever tried to be. I'm thrilled with my A140, even though it's really weird and a bit dull behind the wheel. It's certainly going to be fun to own for a little while.